In this lecture, we're going to talk about how personality affects our health. Specifically, we'll talk about how personality influences our health-related behaviors, how personality influences whether we take on the sick role, and finally, we'll discuss the diathesis stress model of health and illness. Infectious disease killed people at the beginning of the century. What kills people today? Behavior kills people today. The leading causes of heart disease are smoking, diet, alcohol abuse, and diabetes, and these are all modifiable with behavior. Some cancers just happen, and some cancers are attributable to environments that we have no control over. But many cancers are linked to behavior. Strokes are linked to alcohol dependence, diet, smoking, and lack of exercise. Behavior is one of the pathways through which personality influence our health. And it's led some people to argue that self-efficacy is the penicillin of the 21st century. If behavior is what is causing mortality in our contemporary society, then we need to look at what the determinants of behavior are. And when we look at those determinants of behavior, a primary element is belief in behavioral competence. If you believe that you're not capable of quitting smoking, then you won't quit smoking. If you believe that you can eat a healthy diet, then you'll eat a healthy diet. If you believe you can't exercise, then you never will. So self-efficacy is ultimately the drug that will shift this view of mortality to something else. When we talk about behavior and health, we reference things known as behavioral pathogens and behavioral immunogens. A behavioral immunogen is a behavior that boosts immunity or inoculates someone against pathogens. Exercise, meditation, diet, social support, annual doctor visits are all behavioral immunogens that help boost one's health. Behavioral pathogens are behaviors that act like disease on the body, and they're detriments to the body. Alcohol abuse, smoking, not wearing your seatbelt, chronically over or under-eating are all behaviors that are linked in a very predictive way to health. When we talk about the behavioral pathway, we're talking about how personality ultimately affects our health through behavior. There are a number of ways that we can see the link between personality, health, and behavior through physiology. Remember when we were talking about Eysenck and the link between extroversion and introversion and cortical arousal? Introverts have higher resting levels of cortical arousal, so they are stimulus shy, whereas extroverts are stimulus hungry because they have lower levels of arousal. Now you'll also remember that Eysenck wrote about neuroticism. Neuroticism is something that's linked to activation thresholds in the autonomic division of the parasympathetic nervous system. Those who were highly neurotic had lower thresholds, and those less neurotic had higher thresholds. So people with neuroticism have higher levels of arousal. They report being more tense physically and cognitively. They have more worry, irritability, anger, and depression. And many theorists believe that neuroticism is physiologically linked, and it's described as a high negative affective state. Now, anxiety is a noxious state. It's aversive and feels uncomfortable, so most people are motivated to do what they can to minimize it. And there are some choices that people make that damp down on the effects of neuroticism that have adverse health effects in the long term. And some of these things we could characterize as behavioral pathogens. Smoking, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and sedatives are often used by people to modulate the negative affective experiences associated with neuroticism. If you ask people why they smoke, many people will say, "It relaxes me and I need that relaxation." If neuroticism is an element of personality that predisposes you to anxious states, then neuroticism is a mechanism linking personality and health through behavior. We just discussed that self-efficacy is the penicillin of the 21st century. Bandura's triadic reciprocal model of personality pointed to self-efficacy, if you recall, as a key element of person factors. Remember that our beliefs about efficacy impact our likelihood of behaving in a certain way. Our behavior impacts our beliefs, and our environment impacts both our beliefs and behaviors. You could look at self-efficacy as an element of personality in relation to countless behaviors, such as behavioral immunogens like diet, exercise, and going to bed on time. Self-efficacy affects behavioral pathogens too, like quitting smoking or reducing alcohol intake or stopping drugs. So this notion that self-efficacy is the penicillin of the 21st century makes sense. And then there's this issue of care engagement, where in order to receive positive outcomes from healthcare, you have to engage with it. All sorts of environmental circumstances are going to affect your engagement with healthcare. Do you live in a community that doesn't have a primary healthcare clinic? That presents a pretty large problem in your ability to access care. Social determinants impact our belief about our ability to engage in care too. If you belong to a group in the US that has been historically oppressed over time by social policies, then your efficacy and your ability to engage in healthcare becomes eroded. You might find yourself thinking, what's the point? I'm not going to be able to see a physician anyway. Thus, some people don't engage with the healthcare system, and then their health suffers. Educational opportunity is also a social determinant of health. And your zip code, believe it or not, is a large determinant of health. Where you live is significantly related to your mortality. For instance, there are no grocery stores in San Antonio, Texas. We're talking about a city that has hundreds of thousands of people living in these urban areas. People that live downtown and have higher income can drive to the grocery store in a suburb, but people who are lower income and don't have cars can't drive to grocery stores. So there are people living in these urban areas without access to food, other than what they can buy at a fast food restaurant or a CVS. So this is an example of your zip code being a determinant of your health. When you get sick, what do? Typically, you don't go to work or school. The sick role refers to this constellation of behaviors that are socially sanctioned in the context of illness. And you can think about operant conditioning as playing a key role here. As we're in bed with the covers pulled up to our chins and we're shivering and complaining to our loved ones, often they express sympathy to us. They may come and bring us soup. That sympathy from other people that may not be as forthcoming when we're well can serve as positive reinforcement that maintains us sitting in the sick role. Sympathy and caretaking from others serve as positive reinforcement, and relief from obligations and responsibilities on the job or in the classroom serve as negative reinforcement. An interesting piece of the sick role from a personality perspective is that we differ in our readiness to assume the sick role, and there are differences in our perceptions of illness. Some people power through, and some people play the role more easily. How we define stress differs among people as well, and for some people, environmental stressors may be sufficient to set in motion the sick role. We're going to talk a little bit about this phenomenon called catastrophizing. Catastrophizing has been studied a lot in the domain of pain experience and chronic pain. Some people might be more likely to catastrophize certain sensations than others. People high in neuroticism, for instance, are more likely to catastrophize benign sensations. What is catastrophizing? It's essentially an irrational thought a lot of us have in believing that something is far worse than it actually is. Maybe you feel a weird twinge in your side. Are you the type of person who makes note of this and remains hypervigilant about anything you feel in your body? Two people may experience the same weird twinge, and this process is very different for each. One who attends to sensations more vigilantly may attribute meaning to it, and the other might not think anything of it. If we believe that pain is killing us, then that pain experience will be much greater, and it will have a greater functional impact on your life. People who experience catastrophizing and suffer from chronic pain have worse outcomes, so they're more likely to be negatively impacted in their life and in work. For people who have similar injuries, and one has propensity to catastrophize and the other doesn't, more surgical interventions will happen for the individual who's catastrophizing. And more surgical interventions in these individuals often have worse health outcomes. In the diathesis stress model, personality presents a vulnerability, a diathesis, that may lead to illness, but it's important to note that this happens only when coupled with stress. In other words, personality is a risk factor in developing an illness. It doesn't necessarily mean that personality equals illness unless an environmental trigger is present. The diathesis stress model is taken from the cancer literature. Some research on cancer has looked at a similar model. That stress is, generally speaking, an environmental circumstance. If you have a vulnerability or diathesis to cancer, that doesn't mean you'll develop cancer. There needs to be the right environmental circumstance to trigger that illness. This is a very interactionist approach. A person has a predisposition or vulnerability, either genetic or through their upbringing, for a particular illness, and the illness develops in the presence of stress. So biology or early childhood experiences may load the gun with a diathesis towards a certain illness, like depression or cancer, and stress would pull the trigger to result in the actual illness. In our model here, we argue that diatheses are trait-like in a way. And again, they come from different places. They can be biological or genetic, learned or socialized.